particularly appropriate that this event is being hosted by the Bannockburn House Trust, which is doing very valuable and important work in conserving and restoring Bannockburn House, because, as I'll describe, this elegant Jacobean mansion played quite an important role in the events surrounding the Battle of Falkirk Muir, which we're commemorating the 275th anniversary for today, as it served as the headquarters of the Jacobite leader that day, Prince Charles Edward Stuart. And he was woken up in the early hours of the morning of Friday, January 17th, 1746, in his bedroom at Bannockburn House with some alarming news. It was reported that drums had been heard beating in Falkirk some miles away, and it was feared that this marked a call to muster by the Hanoverian government forces to attack his Jacobite army, who were at that time in no position to defend themselves, as they were scattered in barns, in farms, bothies, anywhere indeed that they could find shelter on a bitterly cold winter's night. So while his army assembled, he called a council of war of the senior officers, and his senior commander, Lord George Murray, was in complete agreement with the prince that they could not simply sit passively and wait for their enemy to attack. They were too vulnerable. They had to take action and take the initiative. And so they decided to advance. So if I could get the first slide, Ross, we can start the presentation. Thanks very much. So this talk draws on the account of the battle that I published in the 10th chapter of Reminiscences of a Jacobite, and on my guide to the battle, The Last Jacobite Victory. In undertaking research on the battle, I drew extensively on eyewitness accounts of men who fought there and on site visits to the battlefield, which remains much the same today as in 1746. And from these sources emerges a very clear and coherent picture of the events that occurred when, on a bleak midwinter's eve, in a terrible storm of rain, high wind and sleet, a brutal battle was fought between the Hanoverian government forces of General Henry Hawley and Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobites. So second slide. The Jacobites decided to advance in two divisions. Their commanders that day are shown in this idealized representation, the soldiers of fortune, which can be seen today in the Howgate Shopping Centre in Falkirk. It shows the Prince in the centre with Lord George Murray on his right and Lord John Drummond on his left. Lord George commanded the Highland Infantry, while Lord John commanded the cavalry and the Irish pickets. Next slide. The plan of advance is shown in this slide. Lord John's cavalry division marched directly towards Falkirk through the Torwood, where it was clearly visible to the Hanoverians, while Lord George's Highland Infantry followed a route along lower ground where their advance was hidden from enemy scouts. The Jacobites hoped that the Hanoverians would mistake Lord John Drummond's column for the main corps of the Jacobite army, so that when the larger Highland division under Lord George advanced, it could outflank them unobserved. Next slide. The composition and strength of the two columns is shown in this slide. Although, as it shows, Lord John's division was less than half the size of Lord George's, its numbers were not insignificant. According to the estimates provided by Lord Elcho, who commanded a cavalry troop at the battle, the total strength of the Jacobite army that day was approximately 6,700 men, of whom just under 2,000 were under the command of Lord John, while 4,700 were under Lord George. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Lord John's division reached the Torwood. There it halted, lit fires, flew the banner of the Royal Stuart, beat the drums, played the pipes, and generally made so much commotion that someone watching the proceedings from Falkirk could have been forgiven for thinking that the entire Jacobite army was encamped there, which was, of course, precisely the point. So, next slide, please, Ross. So what was this man, the Hanoverian commander, Lieutenant General Henry Hawley, making of all this at his headquarters at Callender House? Contrary to the fears of the Jacobite High Command, Hawley had no immediate plans of attack. Having arrived at Callender House only the night before, his tactical position on that Friday morning was essentially defensive. He received regular reports from his officers on the advance of Lord John Drummond's division, but was sceptical as to whether the Jacobite advance was a prelude to a direct attack, and his principal concern was to counter a possible move outflanking his defending forces in Falkirk. Next slide. Hawley's perspective as intelligence reports came to him early that afternoon is shown in this slide. He believed that Lord John's division was the main Jacobite army. He was unaware of the larger division under Lord George, advancing over lower ground out of sight of his scouts. Hawley's fear was that his enemy planned to bypass his forces altogether and swing around Falkirk to advance onto Edinburgh, approximately along the route of the current M9. In summary, the Jacobites had been entirely successful in misleading the Hanoverian commander about their true intentions. It was only after Lord George's Highland infantry had safely crossed the Carron Water that Hawley secured full intelligence on his enemy's movements and became aware that a larger column was advancing rapidly towards the southwest of Falkirk. His crack infantry regiments covering the road to Edinburgh were in completely the wrong position to counter this attack. So, what is he to do? Since his infantry will be too slow to prevent the Highlanders from reaching Falkirk first, Hawley instead took the highly unorthodox decision to command his light cavalry, the dragoons, to advance. He sent orders to Colonel Francis Ligonier to ride as fast as possible to intercept the Highlanders with his regiment of dragoons, along with those of Colonels Cobham and Hamilton, a total command of some 900 horse. It is reported that Colonel Ligonier received this order, quote, with some surprise, unquote, as well he might, because it was contrary to all established battle tactics of the day. The invariable convention in battle was for the infantry to advance first, and then the cavalry to sweep in behind them in a second wave of attack. The reverse tactic, now being employed by Hawley, carried the obvious risk that the cavalry would be entirely exposed to a musket volley with no infantry protection. Ligonier asked for confirmation of the command and, notwithstanding his personal reservations, as a loyal officer, he then followed the order and began to advance. As events transpired, it was to be the last order that Colonel Ligonier was ever to obey. Next slide. This slide shows the battle formation on the Jacobite right flank, with Ligonier's dragoons in red, facing Lord George Murray's Highland infantry, shown in blue. Ligonier sought to draw the fire of the Jacobite infantry by parading in front of them at a sufficient distance to compromise the accuracy of their muskets. Lord George stood in front of his men and ordered them to hold fire until he gave the signal. Next slide. Imagine if you had been one of the officers or men of the Highland infantry standing behind your commander, Lord George Murray, at that moment. Your instinct must have been to take a shot at the enemy cavalry before they got too close, and it must have taken immense trust in Lord George to hold your fire as you watch him leading from the front, sharing the mortal danger to which all are exposed and remaining calm and fearless. So when he orders you to raise your musket to your shoulder and prepare to fire, you follow that order, and you follow his command to hold your fire. Next slide. This leaves Colonel Ligonier with no alternative but to command his dragoons to charge. Only now, as the cavalry close in, does Lord George level his own musket, and his first shot is a signal for his men to open fire. At least 80 dragoons were instantly killed, and among those mortally wounded by that initial volley was Colonel Ligonier himself. Some of the horses reared and bolted in terror, others charged into the Jacobite front line. Next slide. By this point, Lord George had lost control of the Clandonnel regiment, who were in full pursuit of the retreating dragoons. The terrified horses bolted over their own infantry, the inexperienced volunteers of the Glasgow militia, causing havoc on the Jacobite left flank. Lord George advanced with the Athol Brigade, and he wrote in his memoir, quote, "did all in my power to rally the MacDonalds as I marched down the hill." Next slide. So it's now after 4 o'clock in the afternoon and darkness was falling. While the Clandonnel regiments on the right had broken the Hanoverian cavalry attack and were now pursuing them, the picture was very different on the Jacobite left. Some of the Hanoverian horse had bolted eastward across the battlefield and managed to regroup with the infantry to attack the vulnerable Jacobite left. The Prince's adjutant, Colonel John William O'Sullivan, riding across the battlefield, realised with horror that Lochiel's Camerons, anchoring the Jacobite left flank and positioned approximately where the battlefield obelisk stands today, were outflanked and could be destroyed if the Redcoats advanced. He told Lochiel to hold his position and sent an urgent request for reinforcements. Next slide. This next slide shows the movements on the Jacobite left flank. O'Sullivan reported that when the Redcoats advanced, Lochiel's Camerons held their ground. At this point, the decision to hold in reserve the Irish pickets, the most experienced professional regiment in the Jacobite army, paid dividends. At the critical moment, the pickets and Lord Ogilvy's cavalry advanced to shore up the Highland infantry regiments on the Jacobite left, thus countering the overwhelming superiority in numbers that the Hanoverians enjoyed on that flank. In addition, some of the Hanoverian forces, in particular the Argyll militia under Colonel John Campbell, were impeded by the ravine near to the monument, so could not engage. So the Hanoverian regiments were forced to retreat, leaving the Jacobites in full control of the battlefield. Between 4:30 p.m. and 5 o'clock, Lord George Murray decided to advance into Falkirk. "Tonight," he said, "we shall lie in Falkirk or in paradise," warning that if the Jacobites failed to take Falkirk, they would give the Hanoverian army a chance to regroup and strike back the following day. And so the battle was won, the town was taken, and yet after the battle, the victory was not followed up, which leaves one final question: why not? Next slide. The day after the battle was spent in clearing up operations and in burying the dead. The Prince himself, having spent the day of the battle exposed to the elements without food, succumbed to a severe chest infection and was laid up in Bannockburn House. Unable to personally lead the army, he gave orders for them to stand ready until he got better and continue their largely fruitless siege of Stirling Castle. So critical days were lost, giving time for reinforcements to arrive in Edinburgh to strengthen the Hanoverian government army. While the Prince was recuperating, a tragic accident occurred when a soldier of the Clanranald regiment accidentally shot and killed the colonel of the Glengarry regiment, leading to a split between these two important regiments. And the final slide. The tomb shown here in Falkirk churchyard is where young Glengarry, the colonel of the Glengarry regiment, is interred. The Prince did not attend his funeral as he was ill in Bannockburn House several miles away, and this was regarded as a snub by the men of the Glengarry regiment and led to desertions from that regiment. By the time the Prince had recovered, he was left with little option but to reluctantly agree to retreat north where, short of men, money and munitions, exhausted and starving, his Jacobite army was annihilated on Culloden Moor. So, what moral can we draw from the story of the Battle of Falkirk Muir today on its 275th anniversary? Firstly, a makeshift organisation can, through focus, discipline, skill, and no small measure of courage, triumph over apparently insuperable odds, as the Jacobite army did that day. But secondly, even the greatest victory can be undone by a twist of fate, like the illness that confined Prince Charlie to his bed in Bannockburn House for a few vital days, or a tragic accident, such as that which befell young Glengarry. So even in a moment of great triumph, we must always be on our guard against the potential for disaster and possible hubris. So that concludes the presentation.